welcome to our last colloquium of this year. I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Dr. Jenny Root, who is an assistant professor of special education in the School of Teacher Education. Her research talk is titled Teaching Word Problem Solving to Students with Autism and Intellectual Disability, Pivoting Research During COVID-19. Dr. Root previously worked as a middle school special education teacher. Her research focuses on how to promote meaningful academic skills to learners with ESN, with a particular interest in mathematical problem solving. She has authored over 40 publications and served as PI or co-PI on grant projects totaling approximately $3 million. Her Twitter handle is at Dr._Jenny_Root. What we will ask you to do is, if you have any questions, if you can actually put them in the chat. We're going to hold on until the end of the talk to have Dr. Root answer the questions. I will pass it along to Dr. Jenny Root, and I will look forward to your talk.
Thanks. All right, so I'm very excited to get to talk to you about my favorite subject. So we're going to talk about teaching word problem solving to students with autism and intellectual disability, and then how we pivoted that during COVID-19. So we did some things that I never thought we'd be doing, but here we are. Everyone can see my screen okay? It's funny, I've gotten so used to working at home that now I'm back on campus. I'm like all disoriented. So I want to begin by thanking all of the wonderful women that I get to work with in the General Curriculum Access Lab. Current and former doctoral students, as Dr. Sarah Cox has moved on to her own tenure track position at Eastern Michigan University, but all of this is a team science effort for sure. So why math for students with autism and intellectual disabilities? This is a question that I frequently get. My quick answer is always, well, why do we teach math to anyone? And then why wouldn't we teach it to everyone? But more specifically, the most common value articulated widely by administrators, parents, teachers, and faculty in special ed is enhanced quality of life for persons with disabilities, right? And yet, so we have this as our value, but they have chronically abysmal post-school outcomes. So students with autism and intellectual disability are the least likely to be employed of all students with disabilities when leaving high school, only about 26% within 2 years. Those who do work are usually paid below minimum wage, which is legal for students for individual disabilities, and they earn less than their other peers with disabilities. They're also most likely to work in a segregated environment, so meaning only with other individuals with disabilities. So we shouldn't really be surprised at those abysmal post-school outcomes given their in-school experiences. So they have the lowest graduation rates. They're primarily educated in segregated settings, particularly if they take their state's alternate assessment. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the testing system, since No Child Left Behind in 2004, we have two sets of assessments that students in the United States take. So probably familiar, especially if you're a parent or you went through the public school system in the United States yourself, that there are state accountability tests, right? So in Florida, those are the FSAs, right? And so all students take those, including students with disabilities who have IEPs. They often get accommodations, maybe tested in a one-on-one setting, extra time. But then some students who also have an cognitive impairment take an alternate version of that test. It's called the Alternate Assessment Aligned with Alternate Achievement Standards, AAAS. So you'll see that because it's a mouthful. So it's still aligned with grade level standards, but it's been modified. And so this is what all the other students take. So students with extensive support needs, those with intellectual disability, autism. So all students are entitled, and teachers have to provide them with access to the general curriculum, and there's accountability measures there. Well, in a national survey, only 3% of teachers only said 3% of their students could read fluently with critical understanding of this population of students who take this alternate assessment, and only 5% could apply computational procedures. Now, this was a teacher report. Teachers say that they don't feel very comfortable teaching math content. Okay, so I did a survey of 477 special ed teachers of students on the alternate assessment across the United States. So if we look at this, the areas that they felt the least prepared were multiplication division, fractions, decimals, percents, word problems, right? Those beyond what are functional or those earlier math skills. If we go into the data, the assessment data, so I've told you about the survey, what teachers said. Let's look at what the actual outcomes are. It's pretty terrible. So this comes from the NCEO outcomes website. That's I can put it into the chat at the end of the talk. It's a database you can go and play around with. But you can see here, this is just a screenshot. So from the 2016-2017 school year, which is the most recent data available in math in 4th grade. So I was trying to kind of compare it to the NAEP. The general assessment. So these are just students with IEPs, but take the regular test. You're looking at no more than about probably 49% proficiency, with many more states having less proficiency in math in 3rd grade. If we look at students who take the alternate assessment, we never get more than about 16% proficiency in 4th grade. If we look at 8th grade, it's not getting better. So 8th grade general test, again, no more than about 40% proficient, and it quickly drops off. And for the alternate assessment, again, these are students who have an intellectual impairment, so they could have autism, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities. Again, it's about 15% or less of students who are considered proficient on that modified assessment with modified achievement standards. So if you're curious about, well, what about the state of Florida? So if we look at, that's the national level, let's look at the state level. So here's trends over time, looking at the general assessment. So 4th grade math data, students with disabilities, 8th grade math data. Florida's not doing great, right? So we're currently maybe at about 32% and maybe 25% proficient. So things aren't going well as far as math goes. So it's a critical area of need. And so I submitted an IES early career grant that was intended to directly address this issue. So it's going to fully develop an intervention using modified schema-based instruction to teach secondary students with extensive support needs. So that includes students with autism and intellectual disability to solve multiplicative mathematical word problems and to be able to generalize them to real-world tasks. So I was targeting 3 types of math problems. And then what's really cool about these types of grants is it not only funds research development, but also career development. So I've been focusing on developing expertise in mathematical problem solving, skills and mixed methods designs, as well as capacity for grant management and writing. So briefly, sort of the conceptual model of modified schema-based instruction is that we first need to provide these students with access to the problem. Many of them may not be able to independently read it on their own. So we read it aloud or provide a tech ability to read it. It's very important that we support conceptual understanding. So we're not using keywords where they're just plugging and chugging. We're not just teaching them rote procedures. We want them to conceptually understand what is happening in the problem, what is actually the mathematics behind it. And then we help them do that using schematic diagrams and manipulatives. And we want to build their procedural fluency and then support generalization. So MSBI is an evidence-based practice for teaching students with autism. This is a bit of the research across additive problem types. And then it's also been used across multiplicative problem types. So there's a good bit of research supporting it, but primarily this was researcher implemented and in one-on-one settings. So the theory of change for this grant, we were looking at the setting conditions of these increased post-school opportunities. So while the post-school outcomes of students with autism and intellectual disability currently are not good, there are so many opportunities out there. There are increased post-secondary programs. There's increased funding from vocational rehab to be able to get students competitive paid employment opportunities. There's things like here in Tallahassee with Independence Landing opening so that they have more independent living opportunities. But then there's also these federal mandates for appropriately ambitious goals. So there's out of school opportunities, and then in school, we need to match those opportunities or prepare students to take hold of them. We do that by actually providing opportunities for students to learn math In many classrooms I work in, students are taught math only 2 or 3 days a week at most, and often it's through calendar time or a morning meeting. We need to make sure technology supports are available in the classroom, as simple as making sure calculators are available, or making sure that the read aloud supports are available to students. And then how effective this is going to be is the teacher's familiarity and comfort level with the instructional techniques. So I identified some core variables that we've been evaluating in MSBI, which is how we structure the problems to either increase the challenge or increase the support for students. We've been wondering what role do visual supports play, and when can we fade those visual supports so that students can be as independent as possible. Our motto is no more different than necessary. How can we incorporate self-regulation strategies so that, again, students are as independent as possible, building self-monitoring? How do we train for and program for generalization? And then what role can technology play with, which, man, that's been way more of a focus in the past year than I anticipated. And so I originally planned for this to just be 4 iterative studies that would ultimately come out with acquisition and generalization of math problem solving skills. So I plan to do this across 3 phases. The 1920 school year was phase 1, where we were year 1, where we were just developing the procedures and measurement systems and all of that. So getting into the year 1 research questions, first of all, I just want to know, is it effective? Pretty confident MSBI works. It is not a question of our students with extensive support needs able to learn how to solve and generalize these math problems. Without a doubt, they can. It's on us. Have we found effective procedures to feasibly do it as educators? And then on us as teacher educators and researchers, how can I set up the intervention so that it's feasible within all that is a natural school context and all that's going on there? So we want to know what's the effect of this teacher implemented MSBI on solving the word problems. I want to know if students could generalize. I'm not able to take them out in the community, these middle school students. So I had fantastic research assistants, Kat Davis and Sarah Gonzalez, who are now graduates and teaching in their own classrooms. They created some video-based problems. I want to know, do they like it? Because who cares if it's effective, but they don't like it, they're not going to keep doing it. And then how should we measure fidelity? What are the essential components? I'm still working on that one. So who are our participants? We had 3 teachers and 6 students. So you can see we have Miss Kat, Miss Gonzo, and Mr. Gibbs. Miss Gonzo was actually doing her student teaching in Mr. Gibbs' classroom. So students 4 through 6 were actually in the same classroom, but in 2 small groups. So while she technically had 0 years of experience, she was enrolled in our BSMS program. She had done research with me prior, so she was familiar with MSBI. So then we had 6 boys with ASD and ID, who we gave them the key math, which is an individually administered test of mathematic skills, and they all scored at or below the first percentile. I used a single case multiple probe across participants design, and it had a couple of experimental conditions. So we had baseline, and that's where we just provide the students with the materials and say, show me how to solve the problem, right? So we just want to see what are they able to do before intervention. We then had intervention phase, and then we assessed generalization to those video problems, and then maintenance. Our primary dependent variable that we were making phase change decisions on was independent, correct problem-solving behaviors. So we had a scale of 6. So these are the 6 behaviors that we were measuring. And I'll align those with our worksheet in a second. But know that they were able to solve 2 problems independently in every session. So it was a scale of 12. They could earn up to 12 points, essentially, in every session. So if you're not familiar with single case design, whereas group designs might have like a experimental group and a control group, and so you're looking at the between participants effects. In single case, you're looking at within. So you're looking at the individual changes from one participant to another, and then how those are staggered over time and replicated, which will probably make more sense when I show you the graph. So here was our research sequence. We had baseline. Those were done by researchers. Data was collected. We then did some teacher professional development. So those of you who might be doing intervention research, I have learned that you don't do the teacher PD until you do the baseline, because sometimes they just can't help but use the strategies. So then we did the teacher PD. We then had some introductory lessons that were taught by the teachers, and then student chosen lessons taught by the teachers, with research assistants helping as needed. In my postdoc, Dr. Sarah Cox, because this was during the spring testing time. So there were some days that we had to fill in. Here's the teacher PD model. We used a behavioral skills training approach, which is an evidence-based practice for teaching others to then implement skills. BST has 4 components. It's very simple. You give the instructions, you model, they practice, and you give them feedback. So we gave the instructions via a 25-minute video so that the teachers could view it on their own time. And then the Addie and Sarah Cox met with the teachers, and they modeled the strategy. The teachers then role played, and so that's the rehearsal, and then they received feedback. And then we did some ongoing observation with immediate feedback if needed. Here's the lesson sequence that we followed. So in these introductory lessons, no data was taken as far as student responding. They didn't have an opportunity for an independent response. And really the purpose of this lesson was to reduce the cognitive load, so that we sort of scaffold the information, building up their conceptual understanding of multiplication before we started introducing procedures for it. So the first lesson, we explicitly taught vocabulary, reference, scalar, product, and introduced and compared value, and introduced students to what is multiplication. For many of them, this was the first time they had been exposed to multiplication, despite the fact that it really begins in 2nd, 3rd grade, as far as the grade level standards, and gave lots of opportunities for students to engage and practice with hands-on materials. In the second lesson, we introduced students to the heuristic, or the problem-solving attack strategy, and the schematic diagrams, which you can see down here. And we did that with using word problems where all the quantities were known. So they would use manipulatives to model, for example, this problem down here, how George, he played 4 songs, George had 3 times more songs, George had 12 songs. And so we saw how you could map that out. So we weren't focused on solving for anything, but rather just showing what's happening in the problem in the schematic diagram. And again, then we would talk about, how can we use math and music? Because we were wanting to really contextualize the math. We then moved into the third lesson, where we introduced students to the problems with unknown quantities, and modeled how to use the heuristic and graphic organizer, or schematic diagram, to solve the problems with unknown quantities using variables. So here's what the heuristic looked like in this study. You can see up top is the word problem. We provided this to students on just a piece of paper. They had, here's the schematic diagram. They actually had a choice of 3. So we didn't provide it for them. They had to choose which schematic diagram matched the problem type, because as we move into future studies, we'll be teaching students not just one problem type, but multiple, and they'll need to discriminate between them. So students were taught to discover the problem type first, diagram the relationship, write the equation with a variable, solve and write the answer. They would provide manipulatives to do that, and then reason about why does their answer make sense. And there were different ways that they could show their reasoning. Written, verbal, use a calculator. There were a variety of ways that they could choose to do that. So then we moved into the student chosen lessons, where we provided students with opportunities to practice the problem solving process with support and on their own. So I want to show a quick video. I think I'm gonna have to stop sharing and resharing. I don't know about you all, but I'm incapable of doing anything without narrating it. Let me do it one more time. All right, and if we are recording, can you pause the recording while I show the videos? The conditions were. Go back to All right, and here were our results. So orient you to the graph a little bit, and I've got it on another, I don't on this one. So the scale was out of 12, and so that's the maximum number of points, essentially, that students could earn in each session. So you can see the y-axis for each of these cases, and then the x-axis represents time. Okay, so in single case design, it's a repeated measure. So we take data on the dependent variable every single session. And so in baseline, you can see here, they have really stable baseline. Students 1 and student 2 had the highest level. So they did something. And then the rest of the participants didn't have any. And then you can see the generalization is that open circle. So in baseline, the generalization level was about the same as where their other problem solving was. The solid bar here shows where we began intervention. And you see there's a big gap. That's where we did those introductory lessons. So we still want to show that time passed on the graph. But once that happened, these guys got it super fast. If you were a teacher, you probably wouldn't do this many sessions. But for research purposes, we have to have at least 5 sessions in a phase. And then we did a generalization session and moved these kiddos into maintenance. So these were taught in a small group together. And then we going into the second group, students 3 and 4. Student 3 did great. Student 4 had a little bit more variability. And so what we did for this fella was we felt like he was rushing because he just wanted to be done, which, I get it. So what we did was put in a contingent reinforcement system, which was basically if he got a certain number of points correct, then he could earn 5 minutes of leisure time, which I think he usually chose watching YouTube videos, age appropriate. And so as soon as we put that criteria in place, he accelerated him at mastery criteria. And then the other folks did pretty well also. And we calculated tau U as a statistical analysis of change, and it can be interpreted as a large effect. The teacher perceptions, they felt like the most beneficial component for their practice was the observations with feedback. But they expressed a lot of insecurity with both the pedagogical and content knowledge related to math, and they really wanted more PD. It was also interesting that Mr. Gibbs and Ms. Gonzo were both surprised by the performance of some of their students because they initially were really hesitant about even including the students in the study. They thought, especially Mr. Gibbs, had a very linear view of math of like, first you must be able to add and subtract, and then you can do multiplication and division. And because these 2 students weren't, in his estimation, fluent in addition and subtraction, they weren't ready for multiplication and division. And that ready for language is very, it's pervasive in special ed. So they were very surprised like at how well they did. So is it effective? Yeah, it was. And the students could generalize. It was limited measurement because we only did it once in intervention and once in baseline and once in intervention. More rigorous would have been evaluating more frequently. Did they like it? Teachers did. But what I didn't say was right here was when school shut down due to COVID. So this was spring break 2020. And thanks to the amazing Dr. Sarah Cox and Addie McConaughey, who sort of saw this on the horizon, we were able to rush in and get, hopefully publishable data before school shut down. So we weren't able to get a lot of the post measures. And even we had to scale back our social validity measures with our teachers. And as far as how to measure fidelity, what we realized was we need to link the materials that we give teachers as far as to use as they teach with the fidelity. So we sort of had given them all this stuff, and it wasn't clear what are the negotiables and non-negotiables. Like what are the active ingredients that need to be there versus the things that are like sprinkles on top or suggestions, and so that's what we realized. And then schools were shut down, right? So this was my lovely plan, and then COVID happened. So it seemed like we need to make a change. And so this is the new plan. So we addressed the multiplicative comparison problem type in that first study. And then what we've done is we pivoted and we kept the same that intervention that we did in spring of 2020 with teachers and paper worksheets and the way we always thought that we would teach it, and we translated it to a virtual caregiver-assisted intervention. So we were able to use all the same materials that we had, well, the core of the same materials, right? Not all the same, and use that. And then moving forward, we're now actually, and it was video-based, which I'll get to into a minute. And then now we took what we learned from that and are currently doing a study in Montana with a teacher who's, again, doing the same problem type, but we're sort of adding what we learned. And then next year, fingers crossed, we'll be back in the school system here to continue. But when COVID happened, what it did was it really amplified the existing challenges to high quality math for students with developmental disabilities. So the challenges were already there, the inequities were already there, and it just made things so much worse. And so along with Taryn Wade and Addie McConaughey and Sarah Cox, we wrote an AERA Division K grant that helped to fund some of this. And then I also wrote an Autism Science Foundation grant. And so what we wanted to do was see how could teachers support math instruction in a way that's efficient, effective, and equitable. We just felt like it was our responsibility as teacher educators to provide some sort of model or assistance, because there was no research out there, because I don't know that it's what we would suggest as best practice. But if it's going to be done, and it seems like now, I read a survey that 1 in 5 school systems are planning on continuing to incorporate distance learning to some degree. And so we need to find out what works. So our goal was to evaluate the effectiveness and feasibility of caregiver-assisted video-based math for secondary students with ASD. So we rationalized that, a lot of other secondary students are likely to be very independent during distance learning, or have the ability to be, right? Like whether they actually do it or not is like a whole other thing. But secondary students with ASD are still going to need that support. And we also felt that their caregivers may have less comfort in math content than in other areas. And again, that non-traditional instruction is going to continue. So there's lessons that we can learn and take away in the future, with potential outcomes being a model for using maybe video-based instruction to support math instruction post-pandemic. And then also understanding, what do non-educators need? By that, I really mean non-special ed teachers, non-teachers, to support learners with ASD during math instruction. So students with autism and intellectual disability frequently, perhaps maybe more often than not, are receiving instruction from someone other than their special ed teacher. They're often getting instruction from a paraeducator. And then if they're in the gen ed classroom, they might be having peer supports. And so there are many times that non-teachers are helping. And so could this video-based instruction be a way to support that? So our question was mainly, is it effective? Is there a functional relation between this caregiver-assisted video-based math instruction and an increase in word problem-solving behaviors? We also wanted to look at the impact on attitudes towards math for students with secondary students. What impact does it have on their caregivers, and what are the caregiver perceptions? But I'm primarily going to focus on the first one because we're still analyzing the qualitative data from these second questions. We recruited nationally via social media for this, and the inclusion criteria was just anyone in 6th to 12th grade with a parent-reported autism diagnosis from a physician or who was receiving special ed services. And we did a virtual Zoom screening, meaning my amazing Ray scholars, to look for one-to-one correspondence, whole number identification, symbol identification, and operations with whole numbers with or without a calculator. And that's really all the prerequisite skills that students needed. They don't need to be ready for problem solving, and they don't need to be ready for multiplication. This is the entry-level early numeracy skills that they need. So we had 7 students with autism ranging from 13 to 19, 5 males and 2 females, and 7 female caregivers from across the United States. So we used an embedded experimental mixed methods design. This is mixed methods is an area that I'm growing into. With experimental mixed methods, the primary design is your quantitative experimental design. So that was still a single case study with a multiple probe across participants design, very similar, dependent variable. We just tweaked it and made it better based on our limitations from before. But then there's so many other questions that we had. about their perceptions and the feasibility and the impact. And like what happens when caregivers are assisting their students, or when they're supposed to be. And so we collected some qualitative data before, during, and after, which is what we are analyzing now. And then we'll use those together to write up our results and to interpret it, with primarily leaning on the quantitative. Is there a functional relation? But then the qualitative can help us give some context and help explain or maybe understand why we saw quantitatively what we did. So the procedures, again, it's a single case study. So we had baseline. We made a lot of decisions, especially when you see the graph. We made a lot of a priori decisions to balance the need for experimental control and feasibility of a caregiver asynchronous intervention in the middle of the pandemic, right? Especially as all that was going on. So we acknowledged that upfront that our design decisions had some inherent limitations that we felt were worth the offset. So we randomly assigned participants to tiers, and we a priori decided how many baseline intervention sessions they would have. So we did not use response guided decisions, which will be obvious when you see the graph. After the baseline activities, they did 2 introduction activities. So these are like those intro lessons that we had in the spring, but Addie recorded these via Loom, which is a free for educators screen recording program. And so she was the teacher, and the caregiver was instructed to stay and help. We mailed the caregivers and students a handbook so the teacher or the caregiver knew exactly what to do in each session. So like in baseline, help with the technology, please read, please do not help them do the problem. They need to do it on their own, don't give any hints, right? So we provided that information. We also mailed them manipulatives, and we asked them if they wanted to borrow an iPad and an Apple Pencil. If they wanted to borrow that, we mailed it to them. So they then did 6 intervention activities. Each intervention activity, they would watch a model video, which was Addie modeling how to solve the problem. They then did guided practice with their caregiver on a different problem. And then they got a third new problem, which was independent practice. These were all thematic, just like before. Before the study started, we surveyed students and asked for them to rate some themes that they liked. And then we gave them activities that matched their preferences to try and increase engagement. And then after turning in their problem, which we did via Seesaw, they would check their work by watching a video of the teacher solving their problem. This is what the materials look like. So you'll see it looks very similar to the study before, but it's in the Seesaw platform. So students, again, they had multiple schematic diagrams to choose from. These you could click and drag over. And it had some writing tools, and they could record their screen during the independent practice problem and submit it. So we could actually see and analyze. We didn't have a video, but we could hear what was happening. So we could analyze student talk and caregiver talk via the video recording when they left their sound on. So here are the results. I have it broken up. So let me show you this version first. I just wanted to show you how it's all stacked, but when you get 7 people, it's very small. So again, they only solved 1 problem, so it's just 6 points. So it's a limitation when you have a small y-axis. So again, we randomly assigned participants to tiers, and we randomly made an a priori decision about how many probes would be in each session. So this student had an ascending trend in baseline, so that limits the ability to make a causal inference, because we don't know, if you hadn't put them into intervention, maybe they would have kept growing. So had we been using response guided, we would not have put this person into intervention, but we had made these decisions ahead of time. This student had a lot of variability. So you can see kind of up, down, up, down. If the problem had quantities that he knew the multiplication fact, then he got it. If he didn't know the multiplication fact, he added. So that shows a lack of conceptual understanding of what the problem was. And so what we did there, when we realized that was the pattern, the researcher, Addie, started leading the guided practice instead of the caregiver. For this student, we saw some growth, but not on measured behavior. So I think she'll be a very interesting case as we're doing our qualitative analysis. And then you see these 3 participants made pretty great growth. But because we randomly assigned the participants to tiers, and because these 2 participants were randomly assigned to the same tier, we have, if you call it a functional relation, it's very weak because of the variability. The open circles, if you're wondering what those are, open circles were the days that Addie observed live to do procedural fidelity. So we let caregivers do the sessions whenever was convenient for them. But a few times in each condition, Addie would Zoom with them. And so they were being observed. So there's a little bit of the Hawthorne effect here of like when you know you're being watched. And so we wanted to show those on the graph because we felt like it was a meaningful difference in the conditions. But we did calculate 2 effect sizes, actually 3. Alice did another one this week, but I didn't include it here. She did percent of goal obtained. We also have tau U, which can be interpreted as a large effect. And then we did between case standardized mean difference, which can be interpreted as a small effect. So there's some interesting differences in effect size measures, which is more of Dr. Cox's forte than mine. So if you have questions, I would direct those to her. All right, so wrapping up, so what? A token to Dave test is like, what are we taking away from this? Is that asynchronous video-based math lessons could be one way for teachers to support math problem solving skill development, but only if students receive it at an adequate dosage, so it frequently enough, and are engaged. So our sort of hypothesis, which is what we're coding for and looking as we go back through the recordings, is were students really receiving it? Were they really engaged? Were the caregivers there? The caregivers did say they appreciated those lesson guides. And so an implication for teachers would be supporting caregivers in whatever you're wanting them to do at home, be very explicit about the instructions ahead of time, make it, simple. But some of them may need more support. So we didn't really provide feedback with coaching, but the limited prior research on parent implemented math intervention says they need coaching. But the videos benefited both the students and the caregivers because they were both watching it together. So it supported, even if the caregiver was unfamiliar with the strategy or the content, they were sitting and watching the videos together. But it wasn't just a sit and get. They watched one and then they did one together, then the independent practice, and then they were able to check their work if they were following it as intended. But we still want to know, how can the video-based instruction be used along with live teaching by a teacher to support math problem solving? And then can other non-teachers assist using video-based lessons? So as I said, we have a study, this wrapped up in fall. We have a study currently underway in Montana where we have a teacher looking at that. How can the videos be used alongside live teaching? So with that, I would love to see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. We have about 15-ish minutes. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I can share with Dr. Root, or she can answer, of course, or just unmute and ask away.
I want to ask something. I thought it was really, I think you're one of the very few examples of researchers that I know that were able to successfully pivot their research during the pandemic and still collect data. Could you speak to that a little bit more so that the rest of us can, understand how, some decisions that went into, your thought processes for this? Because as we're moving into a new school year, a lot of the effects of the pandemic are still ongoing and we'll still continue to see them in the years to come. So if you can give us your thoughts on that, further thoughts on that.
Yeah, so my first thing would be, you have to stop and think, does it make sense? Right, so some research doesn't make sense to pivot. It didn't make sense in this especially if context is really important. So to me, it wouldn't have made sense to have the teacher implemented because I didn't know what the generalization, what would the outcomes be, what would be hoping to take forward from that, and there was so much going on, right? So whereas the caregiver, once I sort of came out of the COVID fog myself in the summer, I felt like there are important implications that we could continue from this, right? So first is, does it make sense to keep going for people other than myself, right? Other than just because I want to keep doing research. And I mean, I had to mourn a little bit. I think a lot of us did, right? That our science halted and there were things that we had planned on doing and we didn't get to do. So once I kind of put myself to the side, does it make sense for others? Will this information help others? So that's sort of what we did. And then, so logistically also, it was really hard. In some ways, it felt like my first single case study, and it's probably my like 18th or 20th. But the processes that I always use weren't there. I couldn't rely on those. We were all over Zoom. I had, new people to work with. It was just so different. So I think when you do pivot, you need to not expect that you're going to be at the same productivity level, that you're going to be able to make decisions as quickly. It felt new. It felt very new. But then also I've learned place is irrelevant in a lot of ways. So maybe going actually into the classrooms isn't as important as I thought. Maybe I don't need to drive to all the schools and be in all the schools all the day, every day, even though I love that, I miss it. Because one of the limitations of that, and Addie, I'm sure would speak to this too, of the spring study was those teachers were so reliant on us that when we were there, there were a lot of times of parallel teaching and it's hard to pull back. And I even knew that from my years in my doctoral program when I was in classrooms every day doing the seed work for this. So by not being there, it kind of forces us to be better coaches. It forces us to give better feedback, and it forces the teachers to kind of like try it on their own a little bit. And so that's what I'm really piloting now with the teacher in Montana, is how can I support teachers from afar? And then that's probably, honestly, even if we can physically be in the schools here, I don't think that'll be that might be like our tier 2 intervention for coaching, or tier 3, only if they really need us there. I think it'll be easier for us to fade out if we're not physically in the classroom.
I have a question. Actually, I have 2 questions, but I'll start with one. So I really enjoyed your presentation. I am really drawn to the feedback and the data you presented early on in your presentation about what really is a crisis with math in our nation. And so sitting with my reading hat on, because I care so much about reading, so I'm going to tell everybody that reading means everything. However, you make a very compelling case for why math is everything. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that, about this, how you are getting your stakeholders, whether it be teachers or other folks, other researchers, other education stakeholders, parents, to think about math as a priority and beyond the sort of sexy STEM is important, but really thinking about foundationally, math is very important, and we need to be doing more for kids around math.
I think I speak to it almost different because I'm coming from that lens of students with extensive support needs who 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we weren't even sure that we could teach them how to read. Right. And so I feel like math is where reading was for this population 10 years ago. And now, hopefully most of us, there is a science of reading that works for students with extensive support needs too. We can teach them to read. We can teach literacy. We can teach listening comprehension. And it's never okay to say, we don't say like, oh, I'm not a good reader. But it's okay to say, I'm not good at math. Right. Which even that's my passion for this area, is because it was the family joke that I'm not good at math. And then it was kind of funny that this was my my area of research in my doctoral program when Diane Browder was like, how do you feel about math? Because it's what you're going to do for the next 4 years. And so it's hard when parents don't see how maybe their students' skills are going to translate right now, like how those math skills, how do you really use them? But then also it's not reinforced by teachers, because teachers aren't sure how to teach it, what the use is going to be, and if it's even possible. But then to take a step back, a lot of teachers are just like me, where I thought I wasn't good at math. I thought, therefore, I didn't take a lot of math courses in college. I didn't feel comfortable teaching it, so I didn't give it a lot of emphasis, right? And so that's where so many teachers are in special ed. And so I feel like we have to address that. And that's what I've seen over and over from the special ed teachers that I work with. So it's not as much that they don't think it's important. They don't feel like they are capable to make a change. And then also they've never seen it. So we are so far behind in math for students with extensive support needs, and yet it's putting a ceiling on their opportunities.
Yeah, and I'm looking at the chat fire off, and I feel like I could remove math and put in writing, remove math and put in science, or remove math and put in computer science, remove math, but we could throw all the things in. But I do think, I think what your work is demonstrating is that there really are all the things. And there's the sort of whole child comprehensive approach that we should be taking, and math is just as important and foundation to all these other things we want. My second question relates to your methodology. So can you talk a little bit, I know single subject methodology isn't familiar to lots of people. There's a reason why we do it for kids with extensive needs, because finding a sample size is problematic. But can you talk about how what you're finding really extrapolates to populations of students without severe needs, as well as the general classroom, and how we make that link scientifically and methodologically?
Sure. So for people not familiar with single case, they often look at that, well, you only, it's an N of 3 or it's an N of 4. So what are the broad generalizations of it? But actually it has that causal inference, right? And so we've demonstrated, now one study is not sufficient, just as one group study is not sufficient, right? But when you have this replication of findings over and over and over that an intervention is effective across problem types, across demographics, across settings, we can feel pretty confident that it works. Now, feasibly having teachers do it is like a side issue, but MSBI wasn't that came from a larger body of work of schema-based instruction, which the goal is to just teach students to conceptually comprehend the problem by being able to map what's happening onto a schematic diagram, and then teaching them how to discriminate between problem types, with the thought of when they can sort of represent an internal schema externally, that they can solve any type of problem. They recognize that problem structure. And so that we can take out, there's lots of research beyond me to show that's effective for students with learning disabilities and mathematics difficulties and English language learners. So students who are, I would argue it can be part of a tier 1 intervention, that it's effective to teach schematic problem types to everyone, not keywords. We should tear down all the keyword posters. That teaching students to conceptually comprehend the math is going to increase generalization. And then what MSBI would have attempted to do is see how can we add on some additional supports, and who might need which additional supports, and then how can we fade them back if needed, right? So I'm sort of developing a instructional model, like a decision-making framework for teachers of what kids might need more instruction. Tear down the keyword.
I just want to say, as a person, when I was a teacher, I used to love keywords. So
well, they seem to make sense.
Look how science evolves and you can learn things. I just want to
faulty.
say, I used to love keywords. I had my long and short vowel keyword chart for every student.
Well, no, I mean so I'm talking about the keywords for math. So when you see total, it means all. Sarah Powell has a paper coming out now that I think she said it only works in when you get to a multiple step problem, those only work about 23% of the time or less. So they just don't, it's faulty stimulus control from an ABA perspective. And it's just an immature strategy that students are taught. And then really the collective effort that I'm a part of right now is trying to build the science of math parallel to what all of you are doing with the science of reading. So I'm with an awesome group of researchers across the country to work on building the science of math so that parents advocate for it.
Thank you.
We have about 5 more minutes, so.
I agree with you, Rob, about statistics.
Maybe we can find common ground after all. Do I have time to ask a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question about the design and particularly about measurement. Those are powerful effect sizes and exciting ones. My question is, to what extent do you think it's possible there's over-alignment of the outcome measure with the intervention? And a related question, I didn't quite catch, did you use key math for the outcome measure? And if you did you use the whole thing or a subtest or?
Yeah, no, good question. So in single case, over alignment is what you do, right? And so it's a little bit different from group design in that way, because you have to have a repeated measure of what you are observing. So of what you're teaching, right? So let's say that we were doing my master's thesis was on decreasing off-task behavior. So my measurement was % of intervals off task, right? And so it's similarly in academic interventions, though it starts to like make our brains like do mental gymnastics, right? So we did not use a distal measure in this study because it was in the first one, because it was the pilot. This coming up here, Taryn Wade, our resident school psychologist, is going to be helping me look at a couple different distal measures, which might be appropriate. So we're going to be administering several. We might pick your brain on that as well. A few years ago, we did this for elementary students and didn't really find a great one. Not that I would expect huge growth, but yes, it is over aligned, but that is the nature of single case. The key math we just did to get some sort of measure of their math performance, because it could not be provided. There was not one existing for these students from their teachers.
Thank you.
Awkward pause. Okay, so we have a couple more minutes. Any last questions, comments, feedback for Dr. Root?
If no one has anything else, I can completely ask an unprofessional question. Is this group of people saying AP Physics or AP Stats for my high school junior? Which one? Which was the one that wins?
That's
I got to turn in a schedule today. Which one are we doing?
European history? No, that's what I did.
Recommendations coming in the chat right now.
English, obviously.
Someone is asking, hold on, let me scroll back. Oh, Katie's asking, has your team considered expanding out PD in terms of MSBI?
Yes. So I'm pretty excited about a potential partnership expansion with Leon County for this upcoming year to do some sustained professional development and coaching with their ESE teachers. It's not going to be specifically focused on MSBI. It's going to be a little bit broader, but definitely problem solving will be a component of it. And MSBI is just one strategy, though I would argue my perspective is problem solving needs to involve schemas. And I do quite a bit of professional development in other states for MSBI. So yeah, and then our goal is to have a packaged curriculum that teachers can use. Whereas our journal articles provide recipes, teachers don't read those. So they need takeout. And so if we don't give it to them, they're going to go to Teachers Pay Teachers or Unique Learning, which is trash. So we want them to use something that's evidence-based. So yeah, that's our sort of long-term goal. And I just said that on a recording and I'm fine with it. It's the truth.
Well, Katie says Colquitt County Special Ed is interested, so.
Hey, yeah, reach out to me.
Okay, well, it is 2 o'clock, so officially our time has come to an end. We'll stay on for a few minutes here if Dr. Root has a few minutes in case anyone has follow-up or other questions. Otherwise, thank you all It just occurred to me that we haven't really thought about next year what these will look like, but I suppose we'll start those conversations here pretty soon so we can be sharing that information. But thank you all for attending virtually. And we look forward to seeing you again next academic year. Thank you all.
Thanks, Willa.